Thank you again, all of you, for joining in this Friday afternoon. I know these are long weeks and everybody's busy, but we appreciate your taking this time to just get together. It's very informal. It's a conversation around ideas. And so every Friday we will have a different topic. Last week, we had an opportunity to meet with some of our new faculty. This week, we are talking about what we mean when we say transdisciplinary, since we use that word at ASU quite a lot. But before that, Betty, any quick announcements that you'd like to share with all of us?
Sure, yeah. So this was mentioned at the Division II meeting this morning, but congratulations to Eugene Judson and the other members of his team that include Messeret and Sean Jordan, who is an affiliate faculty member with us, for their STEM and Social Capital Advancing Families Through Learning and Doing Projects Award. They've received the 2022 President's Medal, that's the ASU President's Medal for Social Embeddedness, which is a real accomplishment. I believe the award will be formally announced or at a ceremony in December, but we received notification of that, and that's just an incredible accomplishment. One little note too, David Carlson, one of our panelists, recently gave a graduation address at Perryville Women's Prison, which is totally cool. I don't know if we'll have time to ask him about that, but that is,
I think again, that counts as transdisciplinary.
I know, and certainly community outreach. So yeah, very cool. Also wanted to just mention, and we'll return to this later, is the social media survey, which is actually part of the expanded, expanded scholarly roundup that we're using now to try to get more information about all the great work that you're doing so that we can share it more widely. We have a new staff member who's working on enhancing our social media presence, and we'd like to use that media as well as other outlets to get the word out about all the work that folks are doing. Clarin, do you want to say something about next Friday?
Sure. Next Friday in the morning, so not related to just an hour, but we have the Doctoral Student and Faculty Education Research Mixer. I just dropped the link there. You can click the button to register. We are really hoping to get a nice turnout. We've invited our affiliate faculty too. This is informal, just conversation, opportunity to connect face-to-face in person at the union with some of your colleagues. So really hope you can make it if you are physically here and able to join us. And then the just an hour session next week is kind of continuing with this, hopefully, connection between our doc students and faculty, who was the intended audience of these sessions. And the topic is going to be mentorship. It's more a conversation hearing from a few panelists, both faculty and doc students, about how mentorship has contributed to their development and their journey, where they're at. And then also, hopefully, some of our faculty will join to talk about maybe some of the things that were mentioned in the Division II meeting this morning and their interest in mentorship and what that might look like.
Thanks, Clarin. Just one or two more plugs before we start. I just posted just a reminder that we've updated the My Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College website with new information. If there's anything that's missing from the website you'd like to see, we're in the process of building it out. So please let me or Punya or Clarin know what you'd like to see there. And just a shout out for the newsletter that comes out every week. We had a nice profile of Aisha Boyce in the newsletter this past week, and information about these just an hour sessions. So just want to encourage you to open that up and take a look every week. So with that, maybe I'll turn it back to you, Punya, to kick the panel off.
Thank you, Betty and Clarin, and thank you all of you. This is awesome to see so many people here collected this afternoon to talk about ideas, and that's exactly what we wanted this series to be. So when Betty and I were talking about this, I was reminded of something that Howard Gardner had written a while back when somebody had asked him, what is the greatest invention of the past 2 millennia? And he later said this was partly tongue-in-cheek, but also partly serious, that he said it is the idea of the scholarly discipline. That was maybe one of the greatest ideas that humans have come up with, whether it's math or science or history and the arts, that these are essential ways of thinking and looking at the world. Each of these has different purposes, methods of inquiry, different forms of representing and communicating knowledge. And if you think about it, schools and education have typically focused on disciplinary learning. When we think about pedagogical content knowledge, I think when we're talking about content, we are talking about these disciplinary ways of looking at the world. And now we are at this point where we are talking about things like interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary and yes, transdisciplinary. And so, ASU speaks this language. If I actually went and did a search, and it turns out iSearch actually has a category for it, and the faculty who have labeled themselves as working transdisciplinary are across the fields from design to transportation engineering to biomechanics. I mean, even our LLT program has, the first two classes are these transdisciplinary seminars. So we thought it might be good to get a few people together. So I want to thank the panel who have joined us, particularly Dana, who's on sabbatical and taking time to join us today. So without further ado, I'm actually going to pass it on to you guys. This is David Carlson, Dana Hendrickson, and two of our grads of our PhD program, Melissa Warr and Luis Cortez, who have agreed to join us as well. So welcome to the four of you. And I'm just going to ask, maybe David, start with you, Dana, Melissa, Luis, just because I mentioned those names in that order, to sort of briefly introduce yourselves, including your current position and your scholarly interests, and then we'll jump deeper into the discussion. Just one final point I want to make, would love to hear comments, thoughts, questions from the audience. I know a lot of you have opinions on these things, have thought about these things, have worked in these areas. So please feel to drop them in the chat and we will bring them up sort of in the conversation organically as we go along. So David, on to you.
Did you want me to talk about how I think about transdisciplinary?
No, let's start with just letting people know who you are and what your research interests are. We'll do that one round and then we'll jump into the questions, if that's okay.
Okay, so I'm David Lee Carlson. I'm a full professor in the Mary Lee Fulton Teachers College. I teach in the area of qualitative inquiry. I'm currently teaching the transdisciplinary class, co-teaching it. Happy to be here. And I have to say up front, it's always a delightful experience to see graduates of the program come and join us back. It's always good to see your faces here. So welcome. And Dana, thanks so much for joining us while on sabbatical.
Of course, good to see you, David, and everyone.
All right, Dana, see you.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity to chat about transdisciplinarity. That's something that is near and dear to my heart because first I'm Dana Hendrickson. I'm an associate professor in the Mary Lee Fulton Teachers College. I'm in Division II, Leadership and Innovation, and I teach and advise primarily in the EDD program, which is also, I think, an inherently interdisciplinary program, and transdisciplinary as well, since we have students working in all different walks and sectors of education. My research interest is focused on creativity. So as I said, transdisciplinarity is near and dear to my heart because I think of creativity as an inherently transdisciplinary area. And I'm looking forward to talking with you all about it. It's good to see you, David, and Luis and Melissa. Like David said, it's great to see graduates back here again. So thanks for being here.
All right, Melissa.
All right, I'm Melissa Warr. I'm currently at New Mexico State University, and the moon, oh, there's the moon behind me. That is actually going to be a full moon tonight, so I'm told I need to go look at it. I graduated from LLT it was just over a year ago, it seems longer than that, 2021, and I'm really interested in some overlaps of teacher education and design and creativity and technology.
Thank you, Melissa. Luis?
Hi, everybody. My name is Luis. I am also a recent graduate just last year, 2021. And just like Melissa said, it does feel like more than that. I was just doing the math in my head. But I'm now a postdoc researcher at the University of Pittsburgh, which is where I'm at right now, very close to it, physically located, I mean. And I basically, I look into sort of the, I guess how the playing, making, and modding of games and other kinds of things affect people and like what they think and what they do and how they think of themselves. And so I guess I like to think of myself that something that I love to pursue in this kind of work is just investigate how people come to see themselves and the world around them as things that can be changed and sort of explore the role that technologies can play in that, in these things that are happening.
Thank you. All right, so one can get bogged down in abstractions in some of these things. So when we were discussing what would be a sort of a good first question, we thought we would start with, rather than with an abstract definition of what it means, we will get to that, I think, at some point. We'd like to begin with some examples. Could you share some specific experiences that you have had with transdisciplinary scholarship? I'm going to go the reverse order this time. So Louise, will start with you, go Melissa, Dana, and then David.
Sure, so it's good with me. So I was doing a little bit of thinking about this, and I was thinking about some of the stuff I might have done at ASU. Like I said, I graduated like a year ago and did some things, dabbled in a couple of projects with the classes that were mentioned that some of the people here have taught, and I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit more. But I guess the latest example I could think about was the thing I'm doing right now over here at University of Pittsburgh. And I kind of see it as transdisciplinary because what we're trying to produce over here and the problems and solutions we're trying to come up with really can only be seen if we try to combine all the things that we are, coming with our training with. And so we're trying to really look at the roles that little games and apps and other little pieces of technology that are widely more accessible nowadays than they used to be, let's say 10 years ago, what role these things can play in, how we can learn or help families learn and teach them how to read little storybooks with their young children. So we're looking at Latino families specifically with like 3 to 5-year-olds. And we're sort of approaching that problem from the disciplines of computer science and information technologies. We're looking at it from literacy. And by that, I mean like reading and writing and talking and those kinds of literacies. And from game studies, which is probably where my core discipline probably is in. But we're trying to look at the issue from all of those. And really the only thing we can look at, the only thing that comes out when we look at it as transdisciplinary can only come about by looking at it from all of these and not just one of them. And so really the project we're looking at is what the last thing I could think about, and it involves all these like perspectives and issues. And not only that, I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later on, but I think it was alluded to briefly somewhere, where we're not just staying in like our academic community, but we are also going out and branching and trying to have this work have impact on the larger community that is just outside of any kind of university, physical or metaphorical walls.
Thank you, Louise. So I think we're going to see some themes starting to emerge. Things are going off in my head as well, but move on to Melissa.
Yeah, and Louise, it's great to see you and everyone else. I forgot to mention that. So I was trying to think of like what would be good to share. And I'm going to just step back just a little bit. When I was at ASU, and Punya thought it would be really great for me to go and be in an architecture studio on campus with their graduate students for a semester. And so I was interested in design, but I spent a semester kind of there learning and formed good relationships actually with some of the instructors there in architecture. And it really got me thinking a lot about how we learn and how they support their students in creativity and how they support their students in ambiguity, in an ambiguous situation where they had to create something they didn't know existed. And that led me to actually working with a choreographer, Elizabeth Lerman, who also studies creativity, which also led me to work with Michael Rode, who's in the drama program, about creative process design. And that all kind of impacts like the work I do, like from how I teach. In my dissertation, I did some professional development stuff, and that all impacted how I think about things. And one specific example is this is within education. When I was in transdisciplinary seminar, we read a book called The Teacher Wars, and it's looking at the history of teachers and social context and the cultural context around teachers. And at the same time, the Arizona teachers decided to go on strike. At the same time, we were reading this book. And so it became this really dynamic situation. And I didn't see myself going into teacher education necessarily at the time, but started to get really interested in the role teachers play and how to empower them. And I had a good friend in my cohort, and this cohort, Wendy Wakefield. And 2 years ago or so, there was this summer symposium for instructional designers trying to address diversity, equity, inclusion. And Wendy and I had these conversations about complexity and intersectional identity. And complexity is a big idea in design. It's kind of the core idea of how we're working with a particular situation. We're not trying to generalize or take out the complexity, we're leaving it in. And she had this stuff around intersectional identity, which is also about this complexity, this overlaying of identities and how they interact in like a multiplicative way. And so we ended up writing a little chapter on design, teachers as designers to address intersectional identity. And it was really fun because it was with these instructional designer people that they're kind of like, wait, what? But then they ended up really having good conversations around it. But for me, it's kind of looking at those pictures, thinking of the greater, in that chapter, we also discussed like a greater cultural influence of who teachers are in the policies and such, and how that influences their ability to address these intersectional identities. So those are my experiences, and I'll stop talking now.
Thank you, Melissa. Dana.
Sure. Like I said, my interests are in creativity and also design thinking, which are both areas that I think of as inherently transdisciplinary, but I'll give you a couple of examples of scholarship. One from several years ago and one a little more recent. A study that I did a few years ago of creativity among some of the most exceptional award-winning teachers, National Teacher of the Year award winners, was actually inspired by some creativity studies that I read years ago by Robert Root Bernstein, who is a creativity scholar. He's I believe he's also a MacArthur Genius Award winner at Michigan State University, and he specifically looked at creativity among the most accomplished scientists, everybody from Nobel Prize winners to others who have made huge contributions in their discipline, and compared that to the creativity and skills and thinking of sort of everyday scientists, not there's anything wrong with that, but people who hadn't made as huge contributions to their field. And one of the things he found that stood out was that some of the most accomplished creative scientists actively, not only did they have a lot of hobbies outside of the scientific disciplines that they were experts in, but they had a lot of creative, artistic hobbies that they weren't necessarily expert in, just areas that they dabbled in, and tons of outside interest from, photography to woodworking to painting to music, dance, anything you can think of. And more importantly, that they had a greater, in a correlational study, they had a greater degree of these hobbies, but when you spoke to them, they also actively brought in concepts or things that they'd noticed in their range of outside activities that helped them in kind of coming up with breakthrough ideas. So I took that idea and applied it to creative teachers, and I interviewed National Teacher of the Year award winners to kind of see if that same thing played out. And I did find a strong sense of creativity that they had both in their personal life and their professional life, where whatever it was that they were teaching, whether they were an elementary teacher or a high school science teacher, that they had this incredibly wide range of interests and hobbies that they, painting, music, everything you can think of. But they also talked quite a bit about how that helped to not only inspire interesting or good ideas, cool things that they've done in their teaching, but also how it helped them teach through a much more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary lens. So an example would be like a teacher who was a high school English teacher talked about how she was struggling to get students to understand the idea of movements in a text as they were reading Kafka's Metamorphosis. And she was also a musician herself. So she pulled in some of the music students and some of her own thinking to help explain and talk about the idea of movements in music and how that connected to movements in a text, and everybody was really excited and it went really well. And they gave me a huge range of examples of how they did that in all different areas and context of teaching. So I studied that, and I also looked at the idea of transdisciplinary thinking skills, which were discussed in the book Sparks of Genius by Robert and Michelle Bernstein, where they identified these broad thinking skills, abstract thinking, thinking in patterns, careful observation of the world, that were equally applicable to thinking in the arts and the sciences and any area of human life that you can think about. And I study that in creative teachers and how they use a lot of these same skills. And I would mention like a skill of abstracting, and they would go, oh my God, I was just talking to my students the other day about abstract thinking and how critical it is in talking about language as well, and science, all of that. So that was one study. And then a little bit, and then like I said, I think, I won't give you the whole history of my work, but a little bit more recently, I also am interested in design thinking, and I've been doing, working with a transdisciplinary team from different universities One's an astrophysicist, another's a writer, filmmaker, another's interested in sustainability. And we've been developing a model for transdisciplinary thinking or transdisciplinary teamwork using design mindsets. And one of the people in the team is an expert designer. So he's kind of helping us think about how design mindsets can be really valuable for cutting across the disciplines as you're working in transdisciplinary teams. So I hope I didn't go too long, but that's just kind of a
Thank you, Dana. Thank you. That was perfect. David?
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for being here. So for me, I came to education from the humanities. And so I've always, in some ways, thought in very transdisciplinary ways. And one of the reasons I pursued advanced studies in education is because I felt like it could give me an opportunity to study all the things I wanted to study. So economics, politics, history, anthropology, literature, philosophy, and to think through really important issues. And at that time, my field was English education. And so when I got into graduate school, I was really interested in the idea of assessment and writing assessment, and how is it that we use language to create assessments around other bits of writing or language. And so I became very interested in, I would say, bordering on obsessed with that sort of process. And I was really kind of frustrated with the literature in my field, which forced me to go outside my field and to think about my own questions around writing and assessment in new ways and in other ways. And so I think that for me, transdisciplinary research is premeditated by a sense of frustration often, or a sense of crisis, or a sense of like, someone else has to be talking about this maybe in a different way or in a tangential way. And so my first book was built based on my dissertation, but I explored the discourses within medicine, criminology, psychology, political theory, economics, to compose a genealogy of writing and writing assessment in the United States. And that particular study focused kind of heavily on neoliberalism. And I guess that's my example of how I use transdisciplinarity in my own work. But I tend to still think in transdisciplinary ways. I use art and artists and painters and musicians in my own writing and my own thinking and in my teaching. And yeah, so I'll just end right there. Thanks.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for those examples. I mean, I can see sort of these interesting connections and divergences across them, and I think we have some amazing questions here. But before we jump into that, I want to ask one question, and I will determine what the sequence is, because we use these words interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. I think we sort of get what disciplinary means, but what do we mean when we say, or are there distinctions between these? I mean, one of my colleagues is to ask, is this a difference that makes a difference? So what are we talking about when we are saying multi versus inter versus trans? Melissa, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Go to you, David, Dana, and then Luis. I'm just making this up, right? Just to mix things up. And then I think we will jump to some of these amazing questions. So if you could keep your responses short, because there's a lot of interesting questions that I do want us to get to.
Can my short answer be, I don't know? For me, transdisciplinary is stepping back and taking a bigger picture and maybe mixing ideas in interesting ways. And I think interdisciplinary teams are more bringing their own disciplines to work together versus a broader view. But that's just all I know about it.
That's quite okay. And the funny, this is like the Wittgenstein thing of I know, or whatever the Supreme Court said, I know it when I see it, talking of pornography. So maybe transdisciplinary is one of those concepts. And I think I think I had David next, right? So David?
Yeah, okay. So for me, the terms matter, but they don't matter. And so disciplinary is like what's in my English education or my qualitative research field. Interdisciplinary for me would be English education with literacy education, people working together that way. Transdisciplinary would be people who are outside education. So for me, it would be the humanities, those in literary theory or those in philosophy or history, and then combination therein. But that's just a really bad heuristic that I can give you on a Friday afternoon.
No, that's great. I mean, I love this because it shows that, you know, you use these words and the words become part of our sort of vocabulary and way of talking and thinking, which is why I love this conversation, because it allows it to sort of unpack some of this. So Dana, you had, you know, when you talked about transdisciplinary, you were talking of it from the point of view of, you know, the Michelle Root Bernstein work and then the work you're doing currently. So what do these terms mean to you?
Well, when I saw the question about the different terms, multi, inter, transdisciplinary, I panicked a little because I realized I didn't know all the definitions for them, and I was going to have to talk about it. So I feel like I have an understanding of transdisciplinary as ways that, you know, cut across and bring together some of those disciplinary boundaries, like the example that I gave from some of the teachers who, and some of the examples that they were giving me, I think might fall a little bit more into the multidisciplinary. So there were a few instances where they would mention something like, oh, we're all working on the same idea, several teachers in different subject matters working on the same idea, but we're looking at it through the lens of history or through the lens of English, or the math teacher is going to do a unit that kind of ties in this idea. So I feel like that idea of sort of looking at the same thing through multiple lenses lends itself to a little more multidisciplinary kind of perspective, and transdisciplinary is something that I think of as more kind of cutting across those boundaries and showing how some of the disciplinary boundaries that we tend to build are often artificial in the real world. That ways of thinking in the arts are just as relevant in the sciences, and we have this distinction between the sciences as this hard, cold, rationalistic set of ways of knowing, in the arts as more softer and humanistic. But actually, oftentimes some of the greatest scientists have talked about the beauty and aesthetics or expression in ideas that really inspired them. And artists often need to be quite technical and have, you know, rational rules for the way that they're doing things. So that's kind of where I see sort of the multi and transdisciplinary differences in sort of how you look at a problem. The interdisciplinary, I had to actually look that up because I was like, I have a feeling it's one of those things, I think I know it when I see it, but I'm not sure how to explain it. And at least there's this paper, I can put the link from PubMed, people who do research in this area, who talked about the interdisciplinary as a way of analyzing, synthesizing, and harmonizing some of those links between disciplines into a coordinated whole. Whereas transdisciplinary is more sort of transcending the traditional boundaries, and multidisciplinary is drawing on knowledge from different disciplines. I think at the end of the day, kind of like David said, that differences matter, but they don't really matter. The terms, and the fact that I call myself a transdisciplinary researcher and had to go look that up, says something about the terms and definitions, but that's my quick spiel.
Thank you, Luis.
Yeah, I'm happy to hear all of this because, you know, I Googled it. I Googled it myself to try to see what is some of the things that people might come across when you just Google trans versus all these other things. And people might have come across that very kind of similar kind of illustration that shows up almost everywhere, where you have little circles and they keep multiplying and they keep kind of overlapping with each other to try to explain what the concept is. And then at the end, transdisciplinary is just this like one stroke of all the circles kind of melding together. That popped up often. And I think that's one way to think about it that helps a little bit. But I think it's the most hardest one to get. I think probably because of something that I think was alluded to earlier too, where from a very early age, with the exception of maybe preschool, but we're taught in disciplines like we have in school. We have English, we have math, we have science, we have the other classes, and in university, many of them, it's really no different. But then when we sort of try to integrate them across and not just focus within, I think that's where it really starts to come up. And to me, I was trying to think of a metaphor that might help maybe understand this a little bit for me. And people might appreciate it because I know over in Arizona, it's around lunchtime. So I've just thought of food, right? So different foods, you can think of meat as a discipline, you can think of vegetables as a discipline, but when you put them all together, then they can only then can they, like by themselves, they solve the problem, hunger, right? You're hungry, you can eat a vegetable or a piece of meat. But when you put all those things together, it creates something that only can be achieved, a taste that can only be achieved when those things are merged together. And so that's how I kind of thought about it. And hopefully I made a few people hungry for knowledge and for food.
I just want to add to that, when I looked at the history of English, for example, and I was looking at it as an emerging field, it was so informed by so many other disciplines that it was really kind of at its, I don't want to say core, but at its root, a very transdisciplinary project. It was influenced by psychological discourses at the time, military discourses, kind of research methods discourses. There were just so many discourses going on. And so I don't think we lose those kinds of historical threads in our work and in our quote fields. That's why I think the terms matter, but they really don't.
Thank you, David. I hate to put Margarita on the spot, but I don't know, would you mind sharing a little bit about this article that you just shared here, why you thought that was meaningful to you in understanding these distinctions?
You indeed put me on the spot.
I know.
I didn't want to do that.
Okay, well, it's up to you.
I just, someone shared when we were discussing, we have a project and we think of that project as transdisciplinary because it's with School of Arts and Media and Science. And in that regard, and we also have advisory board for that project. And so one of our advisors kind of brought it in and said, okay, you call it transdisciplinary, but is it? And he actually shared that article, which, as I said, I really enjoyed because it puts the structure on into the, like how, what is the best way to think about? And transdisciplinary is actually the highest level of anything that we think is collaborative between disciplines. So it's usually start with multidisciplinary. And I think that majority of us, when we just start, and most of the projects that we believe are transdisciplinary are actually multidisciplinary. And I'll just quickly say what does it mean. So when it's multidisciplinary, it's when work is done in parallel or sequentially from disciplinary specific base to address problems that are common to the number of disciplines. So this is what we do, I think, with education. Right? Education is pretty common concept and problem to a variety of disciplines, and we just combine in parallel those approaches and produce something. And then the next, a little bit higher level is interdisciplinary. It's when researchers work jointly and but still from their own specific approaches and basis to address that common problem. But when it comes to transdisciplinary, I think it's more about sharing conceptual framework and creating this framework from a disciplinary specific concepts and theories. So it's kind of from segmented parts of different disciplines going to one like shared resource. And I'm not sure, I haven't actually seen that many shared conceptual frameworks because one is usually dominant in most of the research that, again, I've seen which is being called transdisciplinary. So what I'm trying to say is that it's actually a very complex and very complicated way to create something transdisciplinary.
Thank you, Margaret. And I'm sorry I put you on the spot, but
no, that's fine.
Just response. So thank you for that. But I'm going to, there have been some amazing questions that have popped up. So I'm going to try to combine something that Kevin and Marina asked with something that in the first part of Matthew's question. And I'm going to rephrase it because it's scrolled up on the screen. I have no idea where it is on the chat anymore. But essentially, one is that, that when we start working in transdisciplinary spaces or interdisciplinary spaces, like, do we need to redefine concepts and ideas that are sort of in a certain discipline so that it works with other disciplines? So, I mean, how does that process play out, if it does, in your work? And the second, then there's a part of it, the flip side of it is that now we need to communicate the work that we're doing. And typically we are, publishing in journals, going to conferences, which have a strong disciplinary focus. And so the question then becomes is how do we then communicate to these audiences? Do we have to go through and explain every sort of different discipline that went into your thinking, and what are sort of the challenges in representing? And so I think the question, if I can tighten it, is like, what are the challenges in sort of working across these disciplines with concepts which are different, might have different definitions and meanings in different disciplines? And then how do you sort of work with the process of communicating it to an audience in a way that is coherent and makes sense to people who might not be thinking in that interdisciplinary way? And I'm just going to leave it open to whoever wants to chip in on this one. And we'll just go. And again, those in the audience, please feel free to raise your hand, jump in with a comment. We'd love to hear from you as well.
I can try this one. So the question for me supposes that there's a sort of kind of a core meaning or an a priori, a centralized meaning of a concept within a field. And I'm not sure that that's always the case. However, I do think that when doing sort of interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary work, it's really important to read widely and to try to get a handle on the concept or the term, and to explain how you're using it and why you're using it that way within the context of your own project. And so it's going to depend on the research question and those sorts of things and your own sort of epistemological positioning. And so I think that trying to understand concepts in other fields required me to read widely and to think about how I wanted to write about that or articulate it, and to justify how I was articulating it based on the information that I had. And so for me, transdisciplinary work is a ton of work. It's a lot of work. And then I don't remember the second part of the question. I don't remember what it was.
The second part was, out of the challenges in communicating it to a wider audience?
Oh yeah, I think that the best thing for me, the best thing I could do was to be as direct with my reader as possible, kind of explaining what I was doing and why I was doing it, and why I was, looking at these documents from the Paris Clinic, or why I was looking at these documents on criminology, and being very explicit with your reader as to kind of the analytic moves that you're making and why you're making them.
Thank you. Anybody else on the panel or outside of the panel want to address this issue of conceptualizing and then also communicating?
As far as the communicating piece, I think that is sort of the challenge that we always face whenever we're trying to communicate, or at least I always feel whenever I'm trying to communicate with a wider audience, is that we get so embedded in an idea and understanding it through and through, and like David was saying, doing the deep reading, that then trying to explain it in ways that are simple enough without oversimplifying is always just a huge challenge that I feel, and that it's something that I think I just consistently try to work on. I don't think I'm expert at it yet, but I think the idea of writing for clarity and for wide audiences, as opposed to sometimes when you're writing for certain journals, you're writing specifically for people who are in your field and who you can take certain things for granted. But one of the things that's been interesting to me, at least in working with the transdisciplinary team that I mentioned, is that we have to have a lot more discussion of certain things to come to and formulate some of those shared understandings. The design expert on the team, who's in the Herberger College, since we're writing about the idea of design mindsets, really took I thought I understood the idea of sketching in design or speculating in design, but he really explained it from the perspective of someone who's not only read that literature, but who's done that kind of work. And so having sort of other touch points or people that in the cases where you're working in a transdisciplinary team who you can talk to and who can kind of share some of the nuances of what those concepts look like in real life is really helpful for them being able to understand it, but also write about it so that other people who maybe don't have full design expertise like a formal designer would be able to understand it. So sometimes you can't do that. The best thing that you can kind of do is have read widely, try to write it as clearly and explain as well as you can, and then have people read it and kind of give you their take on it, whether it makes sense. But if you can find someone within that discipline to kind of run something by, and people who aren't in that discipline who can read it from that fresh perspective, it can be kind of helpful for understanding if you're clear enough and detailed enough and accurate to the concepts, but also writing it in a way that others can understand it.
Thank you. So I'm reminded, I'll tell you, one of the risks of transdisciplinary is having somebody like Melissa go take a class in the architecture department, because then she would come back and next thing I know, I'm standing in one part of the room with her video camera on me, and she has like, can you make a gesture which captures your idea of teaching? And I'm like, I have no idea where to even start with that, but so yeah, that's
That
one
was
of my-
Elizabeth Lerman, actually.
Yeah, I know
The
it was.
choreographer. Yeah.
So those are the risks to an advisor who pushes the students into transdisciplinary stuff. I think Gustavo has his hand raised. So Gustavo, jump in. What are you thinking of?
I think that the key word was Dana's. I do believe in the relevance of transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, all those things that you say, but I don't believe that there is a single transdisciplinary scholar in the world. What you have is transdisciplinary teams. Transdisciplinary scholars, well, maybe you read very widely, but unless we change the whole structure of the disciplines in the universities, it's going to be super complicated. But all this takes me to the same issue. How do we communicate with different audiences? Well, some of us are very good at talking, others are very good at writing, others are very good at designing. We need to do that with institutional support and teams, because it's impossible for me to think that we will mobilize all our knowledge just as individual scholars, actors. We need to have a different structure. We need to start thinking about the communication at the beginning of the project, not at the end, as an act of dissemination. And, can we start doing that with our doctoral programs? Can we start doing that with our masters? Those are super gigantic challenges, but I think that this is a very good starting point to continue this conversation in how to address these challenges. And so,
Thank you.
I'm curious with the team part. Can we do something about rewarding?
Well, I think that your comment is aspirational, because I think that based on the enabling constraints that we're all in, that we do trans or interdiscipline, multidisciplinary in the ways that we can, right? And so I think that that's a really important point, but it's absolutely aspirational. Like, would it be amazing to get, have a quote unquote wicked problem of education, pedagogy, what have you, and put in a team of people that quote it from a transdisciplinary team together to try to work that out or solve that or publish whatever. That would be amazing. But again, considering the institutional constraints, we want to push on those constraints. Absolutely. It's aspirational, I think.
Thank you. So I had like one quick thought here, building on what Gustavo said, and then Luis, I know you have your hand up. I'll jump on to you. So I think that, David Garcia is here right now. I mean, he's written this whole book about how do you communicate to policymakers. And so that brings completely another angle. And David, you and I have talked about like the complications of speaking to a wider audience, where things have to be in soundbite form, and where as academics we are always like, we need more research, and then on the second hand, on the third hand, till you run out of hands. So there are sort of even more complications when we start thinking about communicating these ideas. But before David, I would like to see what Luis wants to add something to this conversation. Any comment that you have, Luis?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I was trying to think of what might be even some perils of not being able to communicate clearly when you're working in transdisciplinarily, right? And just a quick example that I don't think any of us here probably work with issues like this, but let's say that there's a swamp that is filled up and is creating the problem of too many mosquitoes carrying diseases. Depending on who the people are trying to solve that problem individually, they might see a whole different problem with a whole different solution with its own repercussions, right? So I don't know, for example, an architect or someone who works in construction could see that the problem is that there's like a dam holding up the water. So tear down the dam, and that creates another problem downriver where it floods. And I don't know, a chemist might see that the problem is, well, the water that is holding the mosquitoes needs to be maybe more acidic or something like that. And so their solution is to quote unquote poison the water, creating another possible branch of whole complications. And so I think that there can be really very real problems when we don't communicate and kind of stretch across what we are all trying to identify as what is the problem and how can we solve it. And that's just one extreme example. Granted, I know that we don't like deal with those kinds of issues here, but education can have its own set of repercussions, right? Depending on how we approach it. And what we see as the problem that needs to be fixed will be informed and will heavily, impact what solution we try to come up with. And thinking about it transdisciplinarily, I think is much harder than we might think it is originally, because like I said earlier, we usually come from what is typically a more disciplinary based training oftentimes. And so it definitely is, we have our work cut out for us when we try to approach it in these ways.
Thank you, Luis. David, I know you had a comment or a thought.
Yeah, Punya, I appreciate you calling out the book and mentioning this. Much appreciated. But my answer, unfortunately, is not going to be very transdisciplinary, because what I argue is that we're not clear with respect to the audiences. When we say, I'm hearing things like we want to get out to a broader audience, for example, we want to get out to, beyond the university. What I argue is that if you want to affect policy, the audience is politicians, period. They're the ones that create policy. And we need to be very specific about how we communicate with politicians and their characteristics to be successful. I argue that we put in our end of our papers that we want to get to policymakers, but there are no policymakers. There are politicians and there are professional staff. And we need to be very clear about what each does and how to communicate with each. And I would argue that the professional staff can only move as fast as the politicians. So as much as we hate to say it, truth is, as somebody who aspired to be one at some point, we don't want to interact with the politicians. We've got to understand how to communicate with them directly if we want to have the kind of policy impacts that we aspire to.
Thank you, David. And I think that brings in another layer completely, right, of complexity to that process, because as academics or as scholars, not to be, academics sometimes becomes a pejorative term, but as scholars, I mean, our bread and butter is nuance. Our bread and butter is teasing apart difference, seeing it from different perspectives. And communicating, I mean, there are challenges of communicating it to transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary work to disciplinary audiences. There are even bigger challenges in the space that you were talking about. So I think the point is really well taken. I'm looking at the time. I can't believe we are already at 48, and we will keep to an hour. So with that in mind, I want to move on to this question about, and I think this sort of came up in a couple of ways, thinking about sort of how we train doctoral students, how we train the next generation of scholars. So, Gustavo sort of had this aspirational idea that he spoke about, but I would love to hear from our two graduates, because both of you took the transdisciplinary seminar. I know, David, you're teaching it right now. You've taught it before. I know, Dana, you've visited it. So not to downplay your sort of experience of doing it, but I want to hear from our graduates about what their experience with that seminar was. Has it stayed with them in some way? And second, how is this playing out in this new job that you are in? That, both of you as a postdoc, as a faculty member, is this influencing things in some way? Or I just want to understand. I mean, we would love to hear from the two of you. So Luis, I'm going to start with you first, and then Melissa.
Sure. So I remember that class most fondly. And one of the standout experiences for me was a project that we were kind of one of the assignments was to come up with a project, basically write a proposal for something. And it was had to be among, usually it's yourself, you do a proposal, right? But this time it was me and two other students. And we were all kind of coming in with different interests. It was also early on in the program as well. So we were in our first year, probably first semester still. And what stuck out to me, looking back on it now and the things that I'm doing now, I could easily see what we were trying to do there as putting together some kind of grant proposal, right? To explore a problem that we were looking at that we thought was important. And we were bringing in our interest, and we were not only bringing it in, but we were trying to communicate with each other about how the other's perspective can inform ours and how ours can inform theirs, and what might be any new stuff that we might come up with that we might be interested in because of that. And right, that could only come about because of what we were trying to do with each other. And that kind of sticks with me and informs what I'm doing now. And the parallel I draw to the thing I'm doing now is that I'm literally writing a couple of grants with the people here, and we're doing really not much that's different from what we were doing back then. We were just doing it now we're writing it for like a real audience who will actually read it, who will actually evaluate it, who will actually, get back to us. But we're still doing the core of the same thing, I feel. And so that kind of has stuck with me throughout. And it helps me, I think, value and actually seek out other people's perspectives and how mine can kind of meld better with theirs to see what we can come about. To go back to the metaphor earlier, how can the ingredients I bring, if I'm bringing in a couple of vegetables, really meld together to create something tasty with whatever ingredients you're bringing in?
Thank you. Melissa.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned a little bit about like reading about the teacher wars and all the social context going on there. And I think maybe what I learned the most from transdisciplinary seminar was communication with other people and other disciplines. And it's not like, we're all in education, but we still like sometimes, in fact, this was, I think, in a proposal writing class too, we realized how close we were talking about something. We were just using different words. And it just was really good experience to try to talk across and bring together these different ideas. And then that communication piece that's been discussed some. I think I'm trying to remember when we did our proposal, my group, I think we were doing it on teacher retention. And I think Punya actually helped us with our presentation or something and really focusing on how are we going to explain this and present this and communicate this. In my position right now, I've only been here for a month. So I was in Louisiana last year. I am in the College of Health, Education, and Social Transformation. So there's a little bit of skepticism. It's a brand new college and there's some skepticism, oh, they're just trying to save money here. So they're combining a whole bunch of areas, but there is an intention here of trying to get people to work across disciplines a lot more. And hoping to do that. So other than that, I think one of the biggest things for me, and I think there was a question about professional memberships and stuff is, trying to be part of different communities and memberships and different projects. And that's been a really interesting journey. I just said journey for me. So yeah. I don't like that word, but I said it anyway.
Any thoughts, David, your perspective?
I just wanted to really quickly emphasize something that I think Luis said, and that was in Melissa's comments too, which was the idea of seeking out other perspectives. Like Gustavo was pointing out, disciplinarity inherently involves other people, and that's why teams, especially if they're diverse, can be a great space to do transdisciplinary work. But often we are working as scholars, building our own unique portfolio of work and unique vita line of research, and there's a lot of discussion of sort of your unique scholarly identity. So I think any ways that you can find to bring in other perspectives is really valuable and critical. I think I've sole authored maybe just a couple publications in all my years thus far. So I love collaborating and I try to collaborate as often as possible. And if you can find collaborators who are in disciplines, different disciplines, that's great. But if you can also just make sure even in the rare instance where I've solo authored or I'm working solo, finding people that you can run things by that have a very different perspective than you, or who aren't sort of embedded in your disciplinary ways of knowing and talking and thinking, can often really be helpful for challenging you with some unique questions or checking you on whether you make sense and how you're talking about things, or like Melissa said, kind of talking within groups of people and across different ideas, and where there's sort of connection between the common points, or where subtle differences in terms, help us to understand that we mean very different things. So just that idea of seeking out different perspectives, I think, is one really sort of clear way to try to start bringing some transdisciplinarity in where you can.
Yeah, so this sort of responds to a question that Anani had, which is, which I sort of reframed as like, how do you find your tribe? People who you bring different perspectives, but also understand where you're sort of coming from. So David, I think you get to get the last word here. Any final thoughts about teaching the transdisciplinary seminar, or these ideas in general that we have covered before I drop it back? Oh, Luis has his hand up. I'll try and get to you, Luis, just looking at the time.
I'll be really brief. I mean, the only thing I wanted to add is that I think it's really important to connect with other people and learn from their experiences and see where the relationships are. But what interests me is what kind of questions do I pose about my own work and about my own identity and my own field, broadly defined, from interacting with other people. That to me is the most exciting aspect of doing this kind of work. And so, be open to new kinds of questions and repositioning your own questions about your own work and about your field.
Thank you, David. I love that, because I joke that I've built a whole career by stealing ideas from the 2 years that I was in the graphic design program, the visual communications program. And, so it just brings a new perspective. So Luis, so you get the last word.
Well, it was really just to emphasize something I heard Dana say, and it was even in your solo authored projects, right, where the technically blanking on the word, but the credited author is just one person officially, but really behind it, you still kind of drew from so many other people, right? You can think of whatever solo author publication you can think of, but since I know there are a couple of doc students here, even your dissertation is yours, but it's a project you, I guess, mostly worked on yourself, because you had your committee and you had your cohort members that you for sure bounce ideas to and back from. So even when it's just officially just you on a paper, it's definitely not just you. Oh, you're muted, Punya.
He's still learning how the mute button works.
God, 2.5 years into the pandemic and I still don't know this. All right. There we go. Well, thank you. I'm looking at the time, and thank you. I'm impressed and amazed and grateful that around 40 people showed up Friday afternoon to have this conversation around what it means to do research, that cuts across boundaries, how one keeps oneself fresh and asking new questions. So thank you very much, Betty. I'm going to pass it on to you for any comments and any quick announcements about next week and so on. But again, thank you, everybody, for joining in.
Yes, I just want to add my thanks. And we already talked a little bit about next week. I encourage you to look at the newsletter that's coming out for an update on the topics and guests for next week. And just wanted to put in a final plug for the Learning Futures Collaboratives, in which I think our groups of faculty and students are really trying to do a lot of the things that we talked about today in terms of working across different mindsets and disciplines. I encourage you again to look at the newsletter for updates. And if you're interested, they're all open for new participants, and we're always looking for new ideas for those collaboratives. So hopefully today's discussion may have inspired a few of you to think about those groups and how they might support your own work. So thanks again. Thanks to Punya for facilitating, and thanks so much to our 4 panelists. This was a wonderful conversation, and we are going to follow up with you to get some additional lists of resources that you mentioned to share with a wider group. So stay tuned for those, everyone. With that, thank you, everyone.
Betty, a final plug for the research mixer next Friday.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Clarin, do you want to make a final plug for that, just to wrap that up?
Sure, I will try to find and drop the link again in the chat, but it is next Friday from 10 to 11 in the alumni room at the Memorial Union for all doc students and faculty, affiliate faculty as well. It's just broadly brought together by anything education research related.
Thank you for that. Thank you all.